Mr. Chairman, and I want to greet everyone who's here with us today, and thank you for our witnesses for coming to testify today. I want to just take a few moments to really talk about what drives global oil and gas prices and how that impacts domestic production. So, Dr. McPherson-Smith, I really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts on the macro situation with respect to oil and gas. But let me just ask you very briefly, are you familiar with the Permian Basin?
Yes.
Yeah, so the Permian Basin is the largest unconventional oil and gas basin in the United States, which is actually in New Mexico, which is my home state, as well as Texas. And have you ever been there?
I have not.
And are you aware of the astronomical growth in drilling that has happened in the Permian Basin over the last decade and a half?
Yes.
You are. So are you aware of how many wells were actually in operation in the basin in 2010 when this huge increase in production began? Take a stab.
I will trust you to inform me of that.
No idea, right? So 350 wells were in production in 2010. How many wells do you think are in production as of last year?
Again, I trust you to inform us.
Well, I appreciate that. I know you're here to be an expert witness for us. As of 2021, there were 4,524 wells in the Permian Basin. That is a 1,292% increase in the number of wells in the Permian Basin. And Dr. McPherson, do you know why there was such an astronomical increase in production in the Permian Basin?
It sounds like a lot of jobs were created and there was a high demand for work, a high demand for oil.
So you don't know. So the reason why there was such an astronomical increase in production is because of development of technologies that allowed for horizontal drilling and for increased production in formations like the Permian, which is why domestic energy production during that decade went through the roof and why the United States became one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. Now, I would expect our expert witnesses who are here to testify on oil and gas markets to understand what is actually driving global markets and production. Dr. McPherson-Smith, do you know how many million barrels a day are being produced by the Permian right now?
Again, I trust you to inform us because there are 12 million barrels being produced nationally.
Right, there's 5.6 of them are coming out of the Permian itself. It is one of the largest producing basins. That is an all-time high in production in the United States, and it was hit at the end of last year. And in fact, it is going to hit an all-time high again this year. In fact, in the fourth quarter of this year, it's anticipated that the Permian is going to be producing over 6 million barrels of oil a day. This will be the largest increase in domestic oil production in the history of the United States. Okay, so let's talk about facts and what's actually happening with domestic production. Now, there was a little bit of a dip in that decade and a half of increased production, and that happened in the spring of 2020. And Dr. Paul, can you tell us what happened in the spring of 2020?
There was a global pandemic and an unprecedented recession.
Exactly. There was a global pandemic. There were lockdowns. People were in their houses. They weren't driving their cars. And so as a response to the market, our oil and gas companies reduced their production because oil prices dropped so low that spring that it was no longer profitable for them to be operating their drill rigs. Okay? And they had overcapitalized in places like the Permian where they had literally sunk billions of dollars into individual wells because these are massive operations. These are global multinational companies, right? A single well could have $2 billion in capital actually in the ground due to the horizontal drilling infrastructure. But it wasn't profitable at the time for them to have increased production because of that overcapitalization and the price of oil. Now, the price of oil, of course, did recover, as we know, and in fact, it not only recovered, but it spiked last year, and it spiked last year because of another global incident. Dr. Paul, can you tell us, why did it spike last spring?
Largely due to the Ukraine war led by Russia.
Right. So we had another global shortage. One of our major international oil producers, which is Russia, invaded Ukraine. There was another shortage. They worked with OPEC Plus, and then they collaborated to constrain global oil production. And so we ended up in a situation with sky-high prices and domestic companies that were not producing at their capacity. Now, what they have begun to do is they've begun to produce again, and we expect to see huge production in the next year as we're tackling the climate crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.